As the boarding line thinned and passengers buckled in for the long cross-country flight, Sergeant Robert Bob Hale, 78, felt a rare sense of relief. Seat 15C, an aisle spot in the economy comfort section, was more than just a preference. It was a necessity. A legacy of combat had left Bob with a service-connected knee injury, and the extra legroom this seat offered was the difference between manageable discomfort and hours of throbbing pain. He had booked it months in advance, saving from his modest pension to afford a bit of comfort. But just as he settled in, a flight attendant named Susan appeared, with a strained smile. "Sir, I need to ask you to move to 32B. A family needs this row." Bob hesitated, quietly explaining his injury and the effort he took to secure this specific seat. Susan didn't flinch. "It's just for this one flight." With eyes from fellow passengers now turning toward him and not wanting to delay others, Bob reluctantly stood, dignity intact, but spirit bruised. As he limped to the cramped middle seat at the back, no one applauded his sacrifice. But 9 minutes later, the cockpit door swung open, and what happened next would silence the cabin and change the course of the entire flight. Sergeant Robert Bob Hale had faced tougher battles in his life, but he didn't expect one to come at 30,000 feet. At 78, Bob walked with a noticeable limp, a painful reminder of a firefight in Vietnam that left his left knee permanently damaged. He wasn't one for fanfare. A quiet man from Arizona, he'd booked his flight to Boston months in advance to attend his granddaughter's college graduation. He saved carefully from his pension to secure seat 15C, an aisle spot in the economy comfort section that offered just enough legroom to keep the pain at bay during the 5-hour journey. But just as he settled in, a flight attendant named Susan approached. Polite but firm, she explained that a family with young children had been separated by a booking error, and Bob's seat was the only available row that could accommodate them. She asked him to move, specifically to seat 32B, a cramped middle seat at the back of the plane near the lavatory. Bob calmly explained that the seat wasn't a luxury, but a medical necessity. Susan pressed, citing airline policy. "We can offer you a complimentary beverage voucher," she said with a tight smile, as if that would compensate for 5 hours of pain. Other passengers looked on. The mother of the children stood a few rows back, apologetic and helpless. Bob didn't want to cause a scene or delay the flight, so with a sigh he stood and limped toward the back, his dignity intact, but his frustration simmering. As he squeezed into 32B, the pain in his knee flared. The attendant had already forgotten him, but someone else hadn't. A businessman seated ahead of Bob, who had quietly observed the entire exchange, sent a message through his elite customer service channel describing the injustice. An elderly Marine veteran, displaced from his paid seat due to poor planning and a dismissive crew. 9 minutes later, just as the aircraft was preparing for takeoff, the cockpit door opened. In an unusual and powerful move, Captain David Miller, a former Air Force pilot, emerged from the front. He walked with purpose down the aisle and stopped in front of 32B. Then, with all eyes watching, he stood at attention and rendered a formal military salute. "Sergeant Robert Hale," he said, voice clear and unwavering. "On behalf of this airline and as a fellow veteran, I offer my sincerest apologies for the way you've been treated today." The cabin fell silent. Captain Miller continued, "It was a grave error in judgment and a failure in our commitment to those who have served. Miss Susan, please escort Sergeant Hale to seat 1A in first class immediately." Susan's face turned pale as she obeyed. A fellow passenger had already volunteered to give up the first-class seat. As Bob settled in with space to stretch and a warm drink in hand, passengers nodded with respect. Some clapped softly. Others simply sat in humbled silence. When the plane landed, Bob was met by an airline representative with a refund an apology, and lifetime first-class travel for him and his granddaughter. More importantly, the airline launched an internal review to better protect veterans in the future. Bob made it to graduation on time, and with his faith in basic decency quietly restored. Because sometimes respect doesn't take policy. It just takes one person willing to speak up and one leader willing to do what's right. Sometimes a salute can carry more weight than policy. It started with a simple request. A flight attendant named Rachel asked 78-year-old Sergeant Robert Bob Hale, a retired Marine, to give up his pre-booked aisle seat in economy comfort. The reason? A family of 3 needed to sit together. The seat Bob had paid extra for months ago, 15C, offered critical legroom for his service-connected knee injury, the kind of pain that didn't ease up with time or altitude. I specifically booked this seat for a medical reason, Bob explained gently. Rachel's response was polite but unwavering. We understand, sir, but we must prioritize families. What followed wasn't a loud confrontation, but a quiet injustice. Bob reluctantly agreed to move, more to avoid delaying the flight for others than out of agreement. He limped slowly down the aisle, pain biting at every step, and squeezed into seat 32B, a tight middle seat between 2 indifferent strangers. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a complimentary drink voucher offered like a consolation prize for discomfort and dismissal. But in the row ahead, someone had been listening. David, a frequent flyer and retired Army officer himself, typed a quick message to the airline's Operational Response Center. He detailed what happened, how a veteran with a medical need had been forced to move without care. He didn't expect much. But 9 minutes later, something remarkable happened. The cockpit door opened. Captain Michael Andrews, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and steady eyes, walked down the aisle with quiet determination. He stopped at row 32 and looked down at Bob. Then, in front of a stunned cabin, he stood at attention and gave Bob a formal military salute. "Sergeant Hale," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "on behalf of this airline, and as a fellow veteran, I sincerely apologize for the unacceptable way your seating was handled today." Passengers froze. Silence fell. Captain Andrews continued. "You should never have been asked to move from a seat selected for medical reasons. It was a failure of judgment, and a failure of respect." Turning to the flight crew, he asked if seat 1A was available. It wasn't. Without hesitation, he ordered that the passenger in 1A be offered compensation and moved so Bob could be properly accommodated. A few moments later, Bob was settled in first class. He had legroom, he had dignity, and for the first time since boarding, he had peace. The story didn't end there. When the flight landed, Bob was met by a representative from the airline who offered a full refund, lifetime upgrades for himself and his granddaughter, and a heartfelt apology. The airline also launched an internal review of its veteran accommodation policies, spurred by a single salute. What had started as a quiet act of displacement became a powerful reminder that one person standing up, especially someone in command, can set the standard for honor. Bob never wanted recognition. He only wanted fairness. But that day, in front of strangers at 30,000 feet, he was finally seen, not just as a passenger, but as a man who had given more than most could imagine. The quiet seat swap that echoed across a nation. Sergeant Charles Chuck Malone, 78 years old and a Marine Corps veteran, boarded Flight 412 with one simple goal: to make it to his granddaughter's graduation in comfort and dignity. He had booked seat 15C, an aisle seat in the economy comfort section, one of the few spots with enough legroom to help accommodate his service-related knee injury. The seat had cost extra, but Chuck had budgeted for it. The cross-country journey from Texas to Maine was long, and his knee pain unforgiving. As he settled in, content with the small victory of having secured the seat he needed, a flight attendant named Angela approached with a firm smile. "Sir," she said, "we have a family of 3 that needs to be seated together. Your seat is the only available block that can accommodate them. Would you mind relocating to 32B? Chuck looked up, surprised. "I booked this seat months ago due to a knee injury. I really need the legroom." Angela's response was robotic. "I understand, sir, but families must sit together. This is airline policy." Chuck hesitated. He didn't want to cause a delay. He looked past Angela to see a nervous mother with 2 young kids waiting awkwardly, watching. He didn't want to be the reason they sat apart. With a sigh, Chuck nodded. "I'll move," he said quietly. "But I want it noted. My name is Sergeant Charles Malone, U.S. Marine Corps, retired, and this is not okay." What followed was 15 minutes of discomfort, both physical and emotional, as Chuck squeezed into the narrow middle seat at the back of the plane, wedged between strangers, his leg aching. Angela offered a beverage voucher. Nothing more. But someone had been watching. A passenger named Jim, seated a row up, had overheard the entire exchange. A retired Navy officer himself, Jim felt compelled to act. He messaged the airline's executive response line. "Flight 412, elderly Marine vet with documented knee injury bumped from paid comfort seat to middle seat for airline's mistake. Disrespectful. Needs attention now." 9 minutes later, the plane was rolling toward the runway when the cockpit door opened. The pilot, Captain Raymond Ellis, stepped out. Not normal procedure. He spoke briefly with the head flight attendant, then made his way directly to row 32. Standing before Chuck, he rendered a sharp salute. "Sergeant Malone," he said, loud and clear. "I was just made aware of how your seating was handled. As your captain, and as a fellow veteran, I deeply apologize." Passengers turned. A hush fell over the cabin. "You should not have been asked to move," Captain Ellis continued. "We are fixing that right now." Within moments, Chuck was escorted to seat 1A in first class. A passenger already seated there stood up before being asked, saying simply, "He's earned it." Back in the cockpit, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are briefly delayed as we correct an error made at boarding. Transnational Airlines proudly honors our veterans, and we failed today. That's being corrected." The plane erupted in applause. Chuck arrived at his granddaughter's graduation, not only with his dignity intact, but with something deeper restored. His belief that even in a hurried world, respect still matters. Sometimes it just takes one person to speak up. A salute at 30,000 feet, how one veteran's quiet sacrifice sparked a bold stand. Not all heroes wear uniforms, and sometimes not all of them are remembered the way they should be. On a cross-country flight from Arizona to Boston, Sergeant Charles Chuck Malone, a 78-year-old retired Marine, was quietly seated in 15C, a comfort aisle seat he had deliberately booked months in advance. With his service-connected knee injury, the extra legroom wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Chuck had been looking forward to seeing his granddaughter graduate. He'd saved up for this ticket himself, determined to make the long journey without pain. But just before takeoff, a flight attendant named Angela approached him with a request. "We need your seat to reunite a family with 2 children. Would you mind moving to the back of the plane?" Chuck looked up, confused. "I chose and paid for this seat for a medical reason." Angela's expression didn't change. "I understand, sir, but we must keep families together." The only option she offered was 32B, a middle seat in the very back of the plane. Cramped. No aisle, no legroom. The worst possible spot for a man with chronic joint pain. Chuck explained again, calmly but firmly, that he needed that seat for his health. Angela grew more curt. If you refuse, you'll delay the flight for everyone." Faced with public pressure and not wanting to cause a scene, Chuck nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but write this down. Sergeant Charles Malone, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. This isn't right." He gathered his bag, limped slowly to the back, and wedged himself into 32B. His knee immediately protested. No apology came. No assistance, only a coupon for a free beverage. What Chuck didn't know was that another passenger, a frequent flyer named David, seated a row ahead, had overheard everything, and he wasn't about to let it slide. David texted the airline's operations desk directly, describing what had happened. An elderly veteran, medically downgraded without respect. Minutes later, the message reached the cockpit. 9 minutes after the cabin door closed, something unusual happened. Captain Raymond Ellis, a decorated former Air Force pilot, stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the back. He stopped at Chuck's row. Standing at attention in full uniform, he delivered a formal military salute. "Sergeant Malone," he said, voice clear over the hum of the engines. "On behalf of this airline, and as a fellow veteran, I apologize for the disrespect shown to you. It ends now." The entire rear cabin fell silent. Then, as if on cue, heads turned. A few people even stood. Captain Ellis continued, "You'll be moved to seat 1A in first class immediately. You've earned more than extra legroom." Angela, the same attendant who had dismissed Chuck, now had to escort him personally to the front of the plane. The passenger in 1A had already stood up, willingly offering his seat. Back in the cockpit, Captain Ellis made a public address. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are taking a short delay to correct a mistake that never should have happened. Our veterans deserve dignity. Today, we are making sure one of them gets it." Applause broke out, quiet at first, then stronger. Chuck sat in 1A, leg stretched, a cup of water in hand. It wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about respect. He made it to Boston rested, proud, and more hopeful than when he boarded. Because sometimes, even at 30,000 feet, honor still finds its way to the surface. As dawn stretched across the tarmac, Sergeant Charles Malone, 78, sat stiffly in a cramped middle seat, 32B, his injured knee already throbbing from the lack of space. Just minutes before, he had been in seat 15C, an aisle seat he had carefully chosen and paid for to manage the pain from a service-related injury. But when a flight attendant asked him to give up his seat for a family needing to sit together, Chuck hesitated. He explained his need. He pleaded for an alternative. But the response was clear: move or delay the flight. Out of quiet dignity and a lifelong instinct to serve others before himself, Chuck gave up his seat. No one applauded. No one offered thanks. He was left in silence, dismissed, disrespected, and forgotten, until 9 minutes later. The cockpit door opened. The captain stepped into the cabin, marched straight down the aisle, and saluted. "Sergeant Malone," he said, "your sacrifice will not go unseen today." The passengers looked on in stunned silence as Chuck was personally escorted to seat 1A, first class, by the very crew that had overlooked him. That day, a wrong was righted, not by policy, but by character. In a world rushing toward convenience, true respect takes courage. It's not just about remembering someone's past. It's about recognizing their worth in the present. If you've ever known someone who sacrificed silently, let this story remind you: their dignity matters. Comment, respect, if you believe honor isn't earned by fame, but by service. Subscribe to our channel to keep stories like this alive, where kindness speaks loudest, even when no one's watching.